We'll get started here in about a minute.
Yeah. I don't know what happened there, but I'm glad I'm here.
No, you're here. Welcome. It's in the rear view. So
yeah, there you go.
Okay.
We'll start to enter here. We'll give it about 30 more seconds. We'll get started. A couple more people filing in here. We'll give it a few more seconds. We'll go ahead and get started here. I want to welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us again. This is our third webinar series of getting started for 2022. So welcome everybody. We're going to be focused today on the changes and additions to the 2022 construction general permitting and how it may affect your SWPBP preparedness. Couple of very special people to introduce here shortly. I just want to go through a couple kind of housekeeping of how we'll run the webinar today for questions and answers. As always, we're going to use our chat feature. So you'll want to familiarize yourself with that. That's at your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Sarah Noi, who runs our client success department, is going to be running that chat feature. We're going to have a break for questions about halfway through the presentation and then also at the end. One thing to mention, this is scheduled for 60 minutes. We are prepared to go over that if questions continue to come in. The one thing I will say is everybody's Microsoft Teams account is individually manned or controlled rather. So if it ends at 60 minutes, you can log out and log back in if you need to. But we're prepared to go over the time if to get to as many of the questions as possible. So definitely want to use that chat feature. A couple of things you're going to be leaving with or you're going to receive actually by the end of the week is a couple good resources. One is going to be a checklist that you're going to want to look through. This is something we're going to provide as a resource before you file any of your NOIs. Just go through and Karen's going to talk a little bit more about that on the presentation today. And Luke Owen is our other special guest today that I'm going to introduce shortly, was able to graciously build a presentation out that's going to be very permit specific as well. You're going to be receiving that as a resource. So without further ado, wanted to introduce a couple people. Karen was with us on our first webinar series. Karen works with us as a regulatory expert, more than 26 years of experience helping EHS professionals find solutions to meet the regulations and industry standards. So she's with us today. And then Luke Owen is the owner and principal of NPDES Stormwater Training Institute. Luke, thank you for your service as a retired Marine Corps veteran and started the Institute in 2005. Luke has over 30 years of experience with environmental wastewater and stormwater consulting in the US and Canada. So without further ado, I want to hand this over to Luke and Karen. Thanks for being here. Look forward to it.
Okay, Karen, are you going to launch or do you want me to go ahead and start? I can't hear you. Okay, can you hear me?
Go ahead, Luke.
Okay, all right, excellent. All right, well, thanks so much, guys, for showing up. I know your time is valuable, and you've got a lot going on, and for you to spend just a little bit of time here, I know you're wanting to get something out of that. So it's super important for us to make sure you're getting that information. And so my experience is, by the way, I'm not a retired Marine Corps veteran. I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years. I got out as a sergeant. And I'm very proud of that. And I love this country and everything it provides for us. And I think that's really the foundation of what we're here to learn about, is how we can continue to take care of this country that takes such good care of us and allowing us to make money and yet enjoy its natural resources with fishing and hunting and things like that. So that's really the premise and the foundation of everything that I do. That being said, your time is valuable, and we want to make sure that this thing is meaningful for you. So I wanted to start off by just saying, we've got a bunch of line items and things that we're going to cover as far as the changes to the MPDS permit and stuff. But more importantly than anything is that you walk out of here kind of knowing what to do. This is a really, this is a different type of thing. This is not related to your construction site, but it's related to stormwater management and environmental protection. That's not why you're out there. You're out there to actually make money, and yet you have to deal with this thing called NPDES. So it's well worth it. Many people don't quite understand that. We just want to make sure you do know that. Certain general things about the NPDES permit I think we need to understand is that it is a self-regulating program. You may have been doing something for 30 years out there the same way, and then all of a sudden, maybe somebody complained about your site, or you had some random inspection by a state or federal regulator, and all of a sudden the stuff that you never knew about is actually happening, and yet it's been in place for decades. And so we're here to try to help you understand why that is. The permit, being a self-regulating permit, says this: you don't have to have a regulator showing up. You submit your notice of intent, you submit your NOT, plans, things like that electronically, and you may never see anybody for years, maybe a local regulator, but that's about it. But the rules and regulations are still there, even though you don't see them. And you will certainly feel them if you do get, sued or something like that. I do provide services as an expert witness. I'm involved in the middle of a case right now with some guys, general contractor, that actually messed up. Good people, didn't mean to do what they did, but they failed to install their perimeter controls. And as a result of that, they just buried a guy's lake downstream, and now they're being sued. So understanding how the permit works and understanding how these new changes are going to affect the SWIP and your compliance is a really super important thing. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm looking at the, somehow, looking at the, okay, the second slide. Go ahead. All right, I'm not quite seeing here. I'll take a look at the left here. Okay, the permit, the NPDES permit is on a 5-year cycle. And what does that mean? It means it expires every 5 years, and then it adds new things to it. Now, the federal statutes that provide the requirements are law. I mean, it's really what every state should be doing. Some states don't implement some of these federal statutes, and when their permits come out, then they actually become, they circumvent the federal law. And so that's happened in a few cases that I've noticed. But anyway, the NPDES permit, what we're going to be talking about, is a 5-year permit. It doesn't change ordinarily unless there's some drastic federal law, Congress meets, and there's some radical weird change. They might change it in the middle of the permit cycle, but more than likely not. So go ahead to the next slide. We're here to talk about the federal permit. Now, I bet you there are people that are working in other states. Maybe your company has projects going on in some of the states that are regulated by the EPA. But essentially, it works like this: that if you are, for example, I live in Georgia. When our permit expires every 5 years, we submit, we meet. I'm on the stakeholders board. We'll meet with the GDOT, DOT, and a bunch of different stakeholders. We add our 2 cents to what we'd like to see in the permit, and then it goes to the state Environmental Protection Director approves it, and then he's got to submit it to the US EPA for approval before it becomes final. Now, in these states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Mexico, those are states that are regulated by the federal permit. Now, it's kind of the opposite that occurs there. So the federal government, they come up with their permit, what they think needs to go in, and then they have to give it to the states for them to actually approve it to make sure that it meets their state law and their statutes and things like that. So there's a strong coordination that goes on between state and federal government when it comes to that. There's some people, individuals that are not in this list, like U.S. tribal territories, Washington, D.C., and there's other little things like that that would still have to meet the federal law or this federal NPDES permit, this new permit. Go ahead to the next slide. All right, so what they did, what the EPA did, is they came out with some changes, really just to try to clarify and then also to try to be more specific. When you get the difference between clarity and specificness is pretty significant. So clarity is just kind of making sure that you understand what was written there to begin with, and you may not have been complying with it in the past, you know, in the 2017 permit because you didn't quite understand it. And these are things that the EPA became aware of, or some state regulators became aware of. So they all got together and they said, okay, let's kind of make some things clearer. They did the same thing for specificity that we're going to cover as well. And things with specificity is that, okay, well, yeah, these were not quite as clear, but we're going to be a lot more specific. And it does kind of change things to the permit. It's like, oh man, I didn't know I had to do that. Now I really do have to do it. They've gotten a lot more specific with it. So as was already mentioned, you are going to get a sheet, and it's kind of it identifies the details of the changes, but there is also something on the EPA's website you could Google very easily that is basically the fact sheet. Fact sheets come out whenever permits change, whether you're in a state or using this particular permit, the state general permits. They'll always come out with a fact sheet, and all it does is identify the changes from the old permit to the new permit and gets a lot more specific. So that's what you're going to be seeing later on. We'll send you an email with that information later on. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. Okay. Okay, so as we get into some of the changes or the clarity, some of these issues, I want to kind of underscore something. You can get lost in the minutia of an NPDES permit, especially when it's not your world. I mean, the whole reason I'm here is because I'm a consultant. I do training and things like that, but you know, you oftentimes don't have time to sit there and study what the NPDES permit is telling you to do. You're just here to kind of learn what that is. The bottom line, though, is that I've been on projects where I've seen a regulator show up that is just really good to work with. You know, they've got a little experience, they understand the challenges out there, and so they interpret the permit a little bit differently than maybe another regulator that might show up, or maybe you've talked to them on the phone. And man, these guys are right in the middle of it. They're into it. They're really detailed. They interpret the permit differently than you do. They're argumentative, you know, and things like that. Now, the EPA is trying real hard. I know personally, they're trying real hard to be more of an agency that wants to work with the construction community, but you still have differences in people. You've got to be a people person when you work with regulators on this stuff, understanding that they've got a role and they've got an important role to play in our country's water quality. They're the ones that provide accountability. And if we are not accountable to the things that we have to do to keep our water clean, then oftentimes we don't do it. And so they're there for a reason, and we want to work with them. Same thing with the states as well. You know, so you'll have a state regulator, same type of thing, or maybe even a local regulator out there that's enforcing some of the statutes or the requirements within the NPDES permit. So as we kind of start this off, pardon me, I want to kind of underscore it with that. Get along with people. And, you know, the more you get along with people, the more people, you know, when you get hit by a big storm or you're dealing with snow melt from an abnormally large snow, then they're going to be more willing to want to work with you on adjusting and being flexible, as long as they see that you're trying. And we call that demonstrating your intent to comply. Is also not just making sure all your records are in place and that you're showing your documentation that indicate that you're trying to comply, but that you're also trying to work with the regulators to do what we all want, which is clean water. Okay, so starting off here, we have uncontaminated dewatering discharges. When we talk about fire hydrant flushing, landscape irrigation, vehicle and building washdowns, water line flushing, these are types of things, and there's another slide or two that the EPA felt necessary to throw in and be more clear on, because in construction sites initially, when they were written into the Clean Water Act, were identified as industrial facilities. And it just so happens that the pollutant of concern on construction sites is sediment, so that's a massive difference between a standard industrial facility and construction sites. That said, you're going to see some very similar things to what the illicit discharge detection and elimination system program offers within an industrial permit, as they try to represent those here in the construction. So they just want to make sure you identify those things that are, and that you understand what is uncontaminated. When it comes to waterline flushing or fire hydrant flushing, that's pretty much a no-brainer. We know that that's not going to be a pollutant. But if it's on a site and it picks up sediment, or maybe some petroleum hydrocarbons from the spill that's in the sediment and discharges it, we got a problem. So when you're flushing and when you're getting rid of that water, you need to actually make sure it is being discharged as clean water from the necessary point of discharge from that construction site. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Thanks. Here, identify activities that create uncontaminated discharges, eliminate the detergents that might be there, use dewatering devices to capture sediment pollutants. So that's kind of a good how for sure. Eliminating detergents. I know before I got all into this stuff years ago, I had no idea that me washing my car out there on the street and putting detergent, essentially suds, in the local creek through a storm drain was a problem, but it is a serious problem. Detergents can really kill fish. And so the EPA wanted to make sure that that's identified and definitely specifically identified. And then, of course, some of the activities that you perform, making sure that that water is being controlled on site and not being discharged untreated to the local creek. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. It's all your turn.
All right, thanks, Luke. The next change that they made, or the next clarification that they made for the permittees, are modifications to your NOI. NOI is your notice of intent, and this is basically your notification to your regulating authority saying, okay, this is what we intend to do. These are the things that we're going to do within the scope of this permit while we are in that construction phase. And there are a lot of things that we sometimes, I use the we term generally, but things that we may overlook when we make changes within our facility that do need to be made, the EPA does need to be made aware of. So things like the name of the operator. So if you do have a change within your facility on who is kind of running the show, or another operator comes on board, maybe you have changed operations or for whatever reason, these things do need to be sent into the EPA and they need to be made aware of it. If there are changes that you're making to your modification that would change something within your permit, so for example, if you now, let's say you were going to disturb an acre and now it's 2, or you intend to send your discharge water to another body of water, those things need to go into the EPA, and there is a 14-day waiting period on them. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to stop your construction for 14 days, but it does mean that during those 14 days, kind of focus on another area so that the EPA does have a chance to say, yes, we're good with these changes, and yes, you can disturb more land, or yes, you can discharge to another area. That 14-day waiting period only applies to those changes that are being made, not to your entire permit. So one thing that you can do here is look at your management of change procedures, so that as you do change those things, it kind of signals the need to also alert the EPA, especially on those administrative things like changing the name of the operator, or things that we may just kind of do and think, oh, well, that doesn't really affect the permit. It does affect the way the EPA administers that permit. So look for those things and make sure that you've got that box checked to not only make the change within your permit, but also that you do make that change to the EPA as well, so that they're aware, and so that 14-day does kick in, and all the things that need to happen do on the EPA's end. The next thing is this was kind of a clarification, and it's something that has always been true, but it was kind of neat that they spelled out that the EPA does not endorse specific products or vendors. And this is something, in a previous job that I worked in the technical services department, and this was something that at least 3 to 5 times a week, I got asked for a letter on my company letterhead saying that whatever product, XYZ product, is approved by the EPA for this purpose. And it's something that I sent out a lot of letters on letterhead saying that the EPA does not endorse products. However, it can help you meet these requirements within your permit. So that is something that it's neat to see them actually come out and again tell people that products or services or vendors cannot be EPA approved. There are a lot of EPA approved technologies, but again, that's a technology. That's the EPA saying that we know that this works in this instant. We know that this is good for this application, but it's again not a product or a specific vendor. And they do that on purpose because they're in the business of regulating people. They're not in the business of approving products. There are a lot of companies that will approve products, but those are different companies. They're not EPA. They're not the regulating authority. So things that you can do there is look for that language in your permit. If you have anything that says it's an EPA approved product, you may want to take that out of your permit or out of your SWIP so that you're not implying that something is EPA approved and it isn't. And also hold your vendors accountable for that. When they are selling products and they claim to be EPA approved, check them on that and make sure that they're not inadvertently advertising something that really in fact is not true. The next one, I really thought this was a good change as well. They're looking at how to differentiate between routine maintenance and corrective action. And this is something that when we look at inspections, that's really the main time that that's going to come out. So during inspections, you may note that the grass needs to be mowed or you need to clean your drain outlets. This is a good example of a drain that really kind of needs some maintenance done to it. We need to clear that drain, make sure that the rainwater can get into it, make sure that that vegetation isn't adding sediment to our loads that are going out into receiving waters. So this would be an example of something that would be routine maintenance. And other things that we might do, trimming shrubs, or if we need to clear hedges back on a land, taking care of those things that we might do every day. Think about things that we would do after a construction site has been done. Those might also be activities that we would consider routine maintenance. And they're things that, as I mentioned, probably come up on an inspection and you note that something needs to be done. The EPA is also clear within this permit that routine maintenance tasks are things that traditionally take less than 24 hours to complete. So these shouldn't involve any kind of major reconstruction. You shouldn't be digging out land in order to make a routine maintenance task happen. And corrective actions, in converse to that, again, these are things that we're probably going to identify within the scope of an inspection, but they're things that are going to take longer to complete. So if you need to replace a perimeter barrier, if you need to maybe create a new stormwater basin, or you need to do something that is going to help prevent a discharge of any kind of a pollutant, but it's something that's not necessarily a thing that you're going to be doing again and again, that may take you into a corrective action. And the difference in these two is important because if you're doing routine maintenance, that's not something that you need to note on your permit. You don't need to keep a log of it. But if you are doing corrective actions, they do need to be noted in your corrections log. And that is something that you may need to update your SWIP to reflect. So kind of keep those things in mind and have those things within the scope of the inspectors so that they do realize those things, and if they are corrective actions, they do get logged and they do get updated within your SWIP if they need to be. So things that you can do there is when, after an inspection, if you assign job tasks, put the start and end times on them so that you can verify that it is a maintenance task. It is taking less than 24 hours. Verify that tasks don't keep occurring. So for example, maybe if you've got a barrier fence at the end of your lot and you're replacing that every week because on inspections you see that it's eroding, maybe that's no longer maintenance. Maybe that is something that you need to correct. Look for the reason why it's flooding out in that area or something, and do that corrective action once so that you're not maintaining it again and again and again every week. And develop those processes so that when those corrective actions do happen, you do have that check and balance. Maybe you need to update inspection forms as well, but you do have those things in check so that routine maintenance and corrective actions are differentiated within your permit. And the next item is designing your stormwater controls based on recent precipitation data. We have been going through a lot of different weather patterns, things that some of us haven't seen in a lifetime. We've seen those 100-year storms being updated more frequently. So this can affect a lot of what we're doing with our stormwater permitting. If we're used to an area that maybe is a little more arid and storms don't come through a lot, and now suddenly we're starting to see that precipitation happening more often, or maybe it's converse, maybe the opposite is happening. Whatever those things happen to be, we need to look at that most recent data so that we are designing those stormwater controls appropriately, so that we've got a basin in place that's capable of holding everything that could come its way, so that we don't have those perimeter barriers being washed out, so that we do have all those checks and balances in place for that sort of that worst case scenario that could happen. And also with this, they made a point to look for ways to infiltrate water whenever possible. And that just means putting it back onto the land so that we don't have as much discharge going out, so that those areas do become more saturated with water when they need to be, and we don't have the problems associated with all of that water leaving the construction site. Some different ways to do that. NOAA has a lot of great resources on their site, and you can actually put in your zip code to determine what your historic data is. So you can look at, as long as NOAA has, I believe they go back close to 100 years, maybe even a little more, but they've got all of that data in place so that you can see, here's what's happened in the past 100 years in this specific zip code. So here's what I need to look for. Here's how big I need to plan that basin. Here's how big I need that secondary containment area. Whatever that stat may be, you've got the information that you need specific to your location to make sure that everything is sized properly. And if you do need to update your plans and procedures, you've got that information to do it properly, so that as you're working with your engineering companies or your consultants or whatever, everybody kind of has the same information to play with, so that the plans do reflect reality, and so that you don't have the discharges associated with those big storm events. And Luke, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Something to keep in mind as we're going through all of this, is that around the country, wherever you're at, you have different types of rain events, snow events, things like that. And, where I live right now in Georgia, we've been getting about 65 to 85 inches of rain a year. I mean, that's a lot of water hitting the ground. And with a 1-inch rain event on 1 acre, that's equivalent to 27,154 gallons of water. So just with a 1-inch rain event. Designs are oftentimes for 6.7 inches, 8 inches of rain. And so you have to keep in mind the difference. Your site is how it's going to handle that water as it evolves and as it moves forward. In the desert, you have more wind erosion issues for most of the year, but you do have the monsoon season. And so your plans are going to be addressing those types of things. But in the field, just keep in mind, ground cover, soil stabilization is really a fundamental way of preventing a lot of structural problems later on. And it's a hard thing to do because it's a proactive approach to preventing pollutant, the sediment from getting into your storm drain system or into your detention ponds. But it really is the right approach to make sure that you're complying with your SWIP, and your SWIP being the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. So when we see like drain inlet protection measures, this is a very common thing. And I want to address this. The EPA clarified in several different places with their changes is that inlet protection, as long as that sediment is going to a detention pond on site, is not all that important. I can't say specifically the language, but that was crazy when I saw that. The EPA, the point they're making is that they're not going to make as big a deal of storm drains that are entering a on-site detention pond as they would be if they're actually discharging off-site. The problem with that is that storm drains get full of sediment during construction. And even though the feds have said that's not that big a deal if it's going to a pond, keep in mind that neighborhoods that are built or commercial complexes, like an example in Charlotte, North Carolina, a couple of years ago, was receiving a lot of flooding after the site was finished because the storm drains were full of sand. And so I believe that inlet protection is a really important thing to always do. It's a part of managing that water during construction, and certainly preparing that site for after construction, post-construction runoff, and how it's actually going to be managed. So drains must be protected unless stormwater is conveyed to sediment basins, similar controls. Yeah, but probably smart to keep those inlets, protected anyway. Next slide. So how do you do that? You identify the drains, guard the drains that don't lead to retention areas, filtration media, oil water separators if necessary. Again, oil water separators are kind of unlikely depending on the type of project you're working on, construction job you're on. But here we have a kind of a storm drain inlet, that's not really for sediment. That's a post-construction sediment trap. But we have, of course, all different matters. And every state and the feds have their own BMP guidance documents that they kind of go to. Again, just like Karen said, the EPA is not going to recommend a specific vendor, but there are technologies that different types of vendors make for guarding storm drains. Some better than others. Inlet protection and excavated inlet protection, you're going to use different measures than you would after that pavement's poured and you've got storm drains still adjacent to open lots. So you're going to use maybe filter socks, stuff like that. So just use the appropriate BMP. And to underscore all of this, the SWIP, as well as the permit, are what I refer to as the Bible. You've got to do what's on them. Now, the difference between the SWIP and the NPDES permit is this. The SWIP has to change. It has to adjust to the challenges that site sees. So, for example, if you're going along and you're getting moderate rain events and the existing BMPs are working and they match what's on the design, perfect. It's great. But when you get hammered by a great big, maybe a 3 or 4 inch rain that's still within the design capacity of that plan, you've got to change that plan to match the BMPs in the field. So as we talk about adjusting best management practices, whether it's vegetated cover or structural measures, you have to make sure that they match what's on the design as that site moves forward. That is definitely one of the top violations the EPA sees on construction sites, is that you have a superintendent out there reacting to rain events, doing their best to keep that sediment on site, but they failed to adjust the plan. And many times it takes the design professional, that design pro, that professional engineer, maybe a CPESC, a certified professional in erosion and sediment control, that stamp those plans to make sure that they match what's in the field. Make sure you do that. It's a pain in the butt, but I guarantee you it is well worth your time to do that. Okay, next slide. All right, inspections in arid and semi-arid areas. Okay, once per month after rain events. The seasonally dry period locator tool, Karen mentioned that earlier. It's a great tool. It's super simple. It's an Excel file. You download it. You type in your state, and it'll tell you the dry months. And so really, I love this because EPA is saying, well, for the dry months, then don't worry about it so much. Just make sure your BMPs are still operational. You have to remember your stormwater treatment system is the construction site. And in this course, what we're talking about right now, it is a stormwater treatment system. Heavy equipment, people get lazy when it's dry out there. They're forgetting that, that inlet sediment trap's been run over 1 million times is pretty important when it does rain. Polyacrylamide that we've used to tackify those soils, well, we tackified them and we did that to keep the dust down. We've not been getting a lot of wind lately, so people are tracking over it. They're breaking up that top surface. It starts to blow again, and the next thing you know, you got complaining neighbors. So, make sure you're always on top of your maintenance, and that is by far the most difficult thing to do. One of the most difficult things to do on a construction site. Just make sure those things are operational, even when it is dry. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, and we talked about how document which months the reduced inspection schedules apply to your operation, develop an appropriate inspection schedule, certainly around those months. And just like Karen mentioned, we've been getting some strange weather. We're here in Georgia, I've lived here for 20 years and we've been getting, I've gone through 3 different droughts. We've been getting a lot more rain here lately, and we haven't seen a drought now in, 8 years, something like that, which is really unusual. So, things are changing right now. Just the bottom line is just be ready. Make sure that site's, regardless of whether or not it's raining or it's dry, that your BMPs are going to be operational when they're needed. Next slide. All right, waste containers with lids must be closed. Absolutely, and so here we have building materials and pesticides, petroleum hydrocarbons. We have other pollutants outside of sediment on site. The EPA also wants to make sure that those types of materials that don't lend themselves as a pollutant, like let's say you had some delivery of some building tile or roofing felt or whatever the case is, those are not necessarily pollutants. They're solid and not going to really be responsible for discharging a pollutant into a local waterway. So, but you do have other types of things, and concrete is one of them. Dry concrete, you want to make sure you put that stuff, break that up and put that into a waste bin. All your waste bins have to be covered up, as well as your chemical storage and stuff like that. Next slide. So again, plastic covers, temporary roofs, watertight containers that seal, provide that secondary containment. Again, secondary containment is the containment that would actually involve being able to allow a spill to occur and have it not flow beyond the boundaries of your containment. So really, it just follows right along with the industrial permit requirements there. Next slide. Handling liquid waste from applications and containers, kind of along the same way, but we do have a lot of painters out there, drywallers. It's super easy, especially in the wet states that you have a local creek real close, or it's just easier to just kind of pressure wash that thing or put that paintbrush near a storm drain. Saw that last year, and just making sure it just goes right down to the storm drain. It's not hazardous. What's the big deal? Well, it is a waste and it needs to be properly handled. And so as a general contractor, you should have areas not only for concrete washout, but for handling materials like this, curing compounds being one of those. Next slide. All right, contain the liquid waste for dewatering treatment for sure. Dewatering is states manage that differently. I tell you what, when I moved to Georgia, I couldn't believe how they allow sites to dewater and not require testing. I came from California, and man, you couldn't sneeze on the ground without it having to be tested. So states are definitely different. Make sure you're following local and state requirements that may not be inside of the MPDS permit. And those are great conversation pieces for regulators, for the permitting authority. And also, of course, your local regulators, that you're working under local permits. They have more stringent requirements a lot of times than what is actually in the state permit. Sometimes they're a lot looser, but sometimes they're more stringent. So just make sure as you're going along and dealing with these types of things that you're following those ordinances and those extra requirements as well. Locate any washout or clean out activities as far away as possible from the receiving waters. And again, having these things that self-contained, not just relying on that detention pond to capture any of that waste that you're washing off into the storm drain. That's not appropriate. Next slide. And so update the SWIP site maps when necessary. Kind of touched on that. Can't emphasize that enough. After conducting inspections, perform that routine maintenance, complete corrective actions, and maintain a log. There is a term, and I touched on it earlier, and it's referred to as being able to demonstrate your intent to comply. When I started providing these expert witness testimony services for companies that many times had never seen a lawsuit, I was talking to a judge, and as he was discussing and sharing, the synopsis of the case, essentially at the end of it, he said, I just want to see that somebody's trying to comply with their permit. I'm not here to really crack the whip on people that demonstrated their intent to comply. I'm here to, make people accountable for when they didn't. There's a lot of latitude and forgiveness in the legal community for the most part for MPDS compliance. Of course, we're always responsible for the property damage, regardless of how much we can demonstrate our intent to comply. But that certainly has a huge role to play in how much you may end up being accountable for, if you can demonstrate that you're really trying. And so updating that SWIP, making sure that the best management practices, that when it rained on that site or you received a big wind event or whatever, that you definitely indicate through your documentation, making sure your inspection reports match what's in the permit is super important. Don't bring an inspection form from another state, an NPDES form, and put that into the state that you're working in. That's a really big mistake because these permits are so different around the country. And certainly the ones that we're talking about right now, that federal permit is definitely different. So making sure that the BMPs match what's on those SWIPs and that they're constantly adjusted. Next slide.
So here we want to take a break before we go into the parts of the permit that are more specific for any questions that have come in. Sarah, do we have any at this time?
I do not see any. I don't know if you want to give a couple seconds here for anybody to type.
I'll give them a couple seconds.
Might be a time to ask, I get to talking too fast because I want to make sure that we're not going to be diving in beyond your hour. I know Karen's really conscious of that as well. So if we are talking a little bit too fast, if I'm talking too fast, please say something. And if you need me to repeat something that I've already said, then please put a comment in there.
Sarah, is there anything? If not, we'll keep going.
Nope, you're good to go.
All right, we'll save them to the end then. So now we're moving into some of the additions to the permit. And what I found interesting with a lot of these I come from more of the industrial background, and a lot of the things that they added to this construction permit were very familiar to me from the industrial permit. And the EPA did note that they did look at the industrial permit as well as some of the new RCRA generator requirements when they were looking at these more specific requirements. So again, these may be familiar to some of you, and they're not drastically different. And in a lot of ways, they're very similar to the clarity that they added to the other points of the permit. So the first one was perimeter control. And this is one of the points that the EPA made when they were doing their webinar on this topic was that when you look at your perimeter control, you should install your perimeters where they have a purpose. So look at those areas where maybe you are getting washout. Look at those areas, again, along the perimeter of it, but where do those perimeters make sense? They probably don't make sense to put your perimeter in right where you're doing your construction work. It probably doesn't make sense to only have a perimeter along the very edges of your facility. Where are those things going to make sense? Where are they going to capture the sediment and the pollutants so that they're not being discharged? So they also took a lot of time to show you how to construct your perimeter controls. So if you just have a straight line, of course, if you've got a big gust of water coming down and coming toward that perimeter control, it's going to go around. It's not necessarily going to go through the way you might expect it to. So they kind of have instructions about how to curve the ends of your perimeter controls so that you're not getting that pass through. They also kind of talk you through how to not have undercuts, so not having the water flow under any of those perimeter controls that you have. So that is a good thing to take a look at in the permit because they do have a lot of great instruction there, a lot of nice illustrations that describe how to put that perimeter control in place. And also they're very, very specific about maintaining those and inspecting those. So after each storm event, going out there and looking at all of the perimeter controls to make sure that they are still in place, repairing them as needed, maintaining them as needed, and doing that as soon as possible. So don't let that go for weeks on end. There's actually a construction site about a block from my house right now, and they put in a perimeter control that's really not very effective, and it actually has been undercut and has been for several weeks because they cleared the land, but they're waiting until spring for the construction to actually begin. So that's something that if an inspector would come through would definitely be out of compliance because it has been undercut for more than a week now. So that is something that with this new permit, they are looking at a little more stringently and having those repairs in place sooner rather than later. So check those controls with your inspections and make sure that the criteria is on there so that people know what they're looking for, so that the inspectors do have that clear picture of what what a circumvention looks like, what an undercut looks like, and they know kind of what they need to do in order to fix those situations. The next area, and this is something that built upon those clarifications, and again, something that actually came from the industrial permit, really looking at controlling the chemicals and things that you have on site that are necessary for your production. So this could be the diesel fuel to power your engines. This could be oil to lubricate parts. This could be pesticides, whatever those things are that are on site that we need in order to get the job done. But they're not the soil, they're not the pile of rock, they're not those things that we traditionally associate with those construction activities. Again, making sure that containers are sealed, making sure that you've got them contained. One thing that I thought was really, really interesting within this regulation is, to my knowledge, and I've been doing this for about 30 years now, is this is the first time that the EPA specifically says you need a spill kit. Traditionally, up until this point, they have always said that you need to be prepared for spills, but they've left it up to the site's interpretation of how they want to be prepared for it. This is actually the first mention that I'm aware of where they say you need a spill kit. So it was interesting to see EPA kind of go in that direction and spell out that you need a kit, and that kit needs to be in good condition, and your people need to know how to use the items in that kit. So they don't go as far as saying what the kit needs to contain, but they do specify that you've got to have a kit. It's got to be available. It's got to be in good condition. It's got to be usable. So that was kind of interesting language that they added into this permit to specify that you've got to be prepared for spills in this manner. And they also added a lot of different information on your requirements based on how much you're storing on site. So if you've got small containers on site, you need to have that spill kit. You need to keep those containers covered and closed. If you've got 55 gallons or more, so that would be your traditional 55-gallon drums, any tanks that you have on site, you also need to provide secondary containment for that. So kind of looking into a little more of what we're looking for with SPCC plans. And if you've got an SPCC plan, they also note that whatever you're doing for SPCC would also satisfy the requirements for your SWIP and for your permit. So look at those and look as to whether or not you do need to have that SWIP in place as well. That would be probably very large construction sites where you've got more than 1,320 gallons of oil or petroleum products on site. So maybe not those smaller projects where you've got an acre or two and you've got that little 500-gallon tank of fuel. But look to see if those other regulations do need to be in place and if you do need to comply with them as well. So things that you can do here: conduct your trainings. Make sure that after you do put those spill kits in place, people know how to use them. Also teach people to keep those containers closed. And that's something that kind of stems from that RECRA requirement. If you do have an industrial facility, if you're more used to kind of those permits, keeping those containers closed is very important, because if the container is tipped over, if there's a rain event, those liquids aren't getting out and getting into the environment. And add spill kits to your inspection checklists. Again, I come from the industrial background, but one of the things that I consistently saw, no matter what site I went to, you see these great containers and you open them and they're empty because somebody took one or two to take care of a little leak or spill that happened. And if you don't regularly add those to your inspection checklists, it is quite common for those spill kits to be empty. And then when you do need them for an actual spill, you don't have the resources that you need to take care of those. And next is a little more about dewatering. Dewatering got a lot of attention in this permit cycle. And this goes back to any time that you are cleaning out those pits, cleaning out sediment traps, cleaning out puddles that happen. They make a lot of, they put out a lot of information in this cycle about making sure that when you are dewatering, that those discharges are monitored. So each day that you are doing a dewatering operation, you need to have somebody on site doing an inspection, making sure that what is leaving your facility doesn't have a lot of solids added to it. Now they did put some information in place. They didn't put a strict numeric limit on this, but they're looking for those efforts to be made. So Luke has a great picture here of two different discharges, and one obviously is clearer than the other. We want to go for as much clarity as we can within those dewatering events, but looking to keep those, make sure that you've got those BMPs in place. You are doing whatever you can when you are dewatering, and you are taking the pictures and everything you need. That was another thing that they added, was that you need to add pictures to your dewatering inspections. So taking that before the operations start, taking a picture afterwards, making sure that you don't have sedimentation building up, making sure that you don't have a lot of turbidity in that water after the dewatering events occur. Checking for plumes, ways to do it. Add these things to inspection checklists, because even though inspectors do need to be trained, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, anybody who's conducting an inspection does have to go through training, but if you're 2 or 3 years into a permit cycle, it can be a little difficult to remember everything that you need to check for. So have those things on inspection forms when you do have dewatering operations, so that inspector is reminded of exactly what they're looking for. Are they looking for plumes? Are they looking for sheens that might form? All of those things on an inspection form help that inspector to really check those boxes and make sure that they aren't discharging unintentionally. And Luke, back to you.
Okay, great. So here we go. We're talking about training requirements, but before we get into that, I wanted to talk about, this stormwater treatment system we're calling a construction site, is that, with any type of pollutant, whether it's an industrial pollutant on an industrial facility where they have outside storage of chemicals, or a construction site, you always want to contain the pollutant as close to the source as possible. So when you have an open 20-acre site, for example, that's got all the vegetation's been taken off, you now have a graded site. Well, you want to contain that sediment as close to the source as possible by using preventative measures, being erosion prevention measures, and that's ground cover. And again, for arid areas, that would be the use of polyacrylamide, anionic polyacrylamide, which is much more environmentally non-toxic and safe. Always wanting to contain it first, prevent that erosion first in your mind. Okay, then secondly, you want to try to contain it as close to the source as possible, that's sedimentation. So in other words, your check dams, your filter rings, the devices you're going to place outside of the detention pond to hold back that sediment load from overwhelming that pond is really a key thing as well. So again, kind of in the mindset of water treatment, we're dealing with stormwater treatment. Contain that sediment as close to the source as possible is really the right thing to do, as much as you can. That certainly helps on your maintenance and everything else. When it comes to the training differences, really the EPA, and they've been in doing this now for a couple of years. I actually have a friend that actually works for the US EPA. He worked here in Atlanta in the Region 4 office, and then he moved to the Washington, D.C. office, and he was initially tasked, and years ago, with trying to make the training requirements more specific. You'll read in most of your permits throughout the country the need for qualified personnel. That's a very common question I get, was what qualifies somebody? Really generic. The EPA is like, well, no, we want to have more specific types of training. We're going to provide that. We're not going to be the only ones that do it, but we want to make sure people know what the rules and the regulations are, as well as how to install and maintain those devices once they're in the field. I mean, they go hand in hand. So, for example, if you have a detention pond that is on the stormwater pollution prevention plan to be able to contain 5 acres, and yet, for lack of room during this particular phase, the superintendent decides to minimize that size to maybe a 2-acre drainage area, ooh, that's a problem, So, the training comes into helping people understand that it's not really, when you take a look at sediment storage on a designed construction site, there are calculations that went into that, and so you can't just randomly change those things in the field, even though it's helping your project to move along. You have to make sure your design professional is on top of those as well. So principles, practices of erosion and sediment control, absolutely. Okay, go ahead, next slide. Review current training, update, maintain training. Okay, so kind of along with that, and Karen discussed it a little bit, and I touched on it earlier, is that make sure that your inspection forms, first of all, are something that your permitting authority would smile upon. I mean, some states are better than others. Some states don't really come up with inspection forms that they know would comply with the permit. Others are better at that. But you need to understand what the inspection requirements are. Make sure you include those on your inspection report. Don't just include the best management practices and how they are, during your inspection, and how, if they're deficient, if there's a deficiency, or if it's a violation. Those are things I've seen on all inspection forms. But what I don't see oftentimes are the NPDES permit requirement for frequency of inspection. And so know the difference between deficiencies and violations, and your inspection reports absolutely help you do that. Go ahead, next slide. Documenting signs of sedimentation related to construction site discharges. Yeah. The deposits, the floating media, oil sheen, foam, color, odor, a lot of those like oil sheen, foam, odor, those are things taken from the industrial permit. But certainly if there's chemicals that have been discharged to a waterway, you want to take note of that. I think when you see offsite discharges, this is what you do when you've got hit by a big rain event and you know full well there's nobody in the world that could have kept that sediment out of that creek, or from going off site, or from overwhelming that detention pond. Photographs are incredibly important. Remember, the NPDES permit is a self-regulating permit. It calls on you to basically report violations, in other words, ratting yourself out to the government. You have to do that to comply with your permit. And that goes against our grain. If we see an offsite discharge, we just like, man, hopefully nobody else is seeing this thing. And then you just kind of overlook it, where maybe in time, somebody's going to take note of that deposit of sediment. And then they're going to go back to your records and say, well, I don't see anything in your records that show that you ever did have a discharge or a violation. Any type of a discharge of sediment or any of these other pollutants to a water of the state or a water of the US is a reportable violation, and you've got to take care of it. You've got to report that to your permitting authority, and then of course with a plan of coming to fix it. Once you do that, you take a picture of the violation, you record the rain event that caused it, then you repair it, and then you take a picture of that repair job when you finished it, and you're back in compliance. So it's a matter of reporting your intent to comply with photographs and documentation. Such an important thing to help your site operate correctly, but also, be accountable later on. Go ahead. Next slide. So again, reviewing inspection forms and documents, making sure those forms are meeting the requirements. Pictorial examples. Don't be afraid of taking pictures. Be afraid of taking pictures with something in the background you don't want to have a picture taken of. That happened one time years back. But take photographs of the damage that this last rain event or this storm event caused, and then take a picture of what you did to fix it, and make sure their time date stamped. That is golden. I mean, any regulator that I've ever worked with looks at that like, man, that's awesome. And in the court cases that I've been involved with, or these legal cases, very few of them go to court. But they really do a lot of good to show your intent to comply, that type of thing. Take pictures during inspections to document, look for changes over time. Absolutely. Next slide. Okay, so photo documentation of site stabilization. Here, this is something different. And, I've noticed this actually over the last few years, people voluntarily doing this, that take a photograph, a drone shot of that site when it's stabilized. The federal requirement of 100% cover with a density of 70% is kind of a confusing thing for many people. But here you have in this photograph a construction site in the background, and you have a lot of building materials that are stockpiled on that parking lot. But let's say that the building materials and whatnot are not stockpiled there, and they just paved it. Well, that's 100% cover with a density of 100% of ground cover. You're not going to get any erosion underneath that. But the grassy area that you see there, then 100% cover would mean that you brought a hydroseed truck in, they splattered that hydroseed material, didn't leave any open exposed soil, and then the grass coming through there is perennial. It's a perennial ground cover, meaning that it's a grass that comes back year after year after year. And the density of those blades of grass coming through that has got to be at least 70% dense. There are some methods of measuring that. Some states are more aggressive at that than others. There's a method, I believe, that came out of the University of Nebraska, it was somewhere in the Midwest, called the line transect method. So before a CO is given to a site, then you're seeing a lot of regulators going out there and pulling a tape measure out there at different intervals and looking to see if there's grass blades underneath each one of those. That's something that's pretty, people here in Georgia are very proactive at. So regardless, just make sure that you've got your site 100% covered with a density of 70% at least, and then you can file that NOT after you've removed your temporary barriers. That's something I didn't see here, but a really important part of permit compliance is not just walking away with that silt fence up, not just walking away with your inlet sediment traps still in the road. You've got to remove all that stuff. And if they cause damage later on, then you're liable for it. So remove all that stuff after you've stabilized your soils. Go ahead. This is the how. So take before and after photographs, date each photograph, time date stamps, super important. Ensure those photos are clear and in focus. It's super important. And if you video, make sure you're not taking them like grandma used to take them back in the day, you know? So you want to make sure that they're nice and steady, even pan, and that you're speaking succinctly and to the point of what that video is showing. Same thing if you actually record what's going on with your drone shot. Be very succinct, as if just like your inspection records. Short and to the point, not a lot of abstract thought and stuff like that. You just want to show your permit compliance. Next slide. All right, so the NOI, questions. Will the operator be discharging dewatering water during the course of their permit coverage? Is the operator's discharge from a current or former federal or state remediation site? Well, that's something that if you happen to have like a brownfield site or a site that was formerly contaminated, when they left there, that contamination's gone. If it's like a Superfund site or a brownfield site, you know that they've addressed those issues. But the sediment, there is a chance that some of that sediment could still have some of that pollutant in there. Just make sure that that's addressed. You should know that before you even bought the property, actually, but or started working on that property. Are there other operators who are also covered under the construction general permit at the same site? And if so, what are their NPDES ID numbers? Common developments, whether they're commercial or residential, have different property owners in them. Now, some states have, for secondary permittees, I'll call them, or those builders within an overall development, do have NPDES notice of intent requirements they have to file. Sometimes you'll have a large commercial development where they're all interlocking, their storm drain systems are all connected to the same or a couple of ponds, but they're separately permitted activities. So you just want to address those, make sure that you know who else is draining into that storm system during construction and after construction for sure. Affirm that any personnel conducting inspections at the site will meet the modified training requirements. So again, the EPA, and I think for good reason, needed to make sure that qualified personnel, there's a little bit more to it than just maybe taking a 1-hour class on video. You know, that if you are taking courses, that the online courses or the in-classroom courses are provided to actually show you what that permit requires. Not just what another state's permit requires or whatever, but what that permit requires. And then also the BMPs, the best management practices, how they need to be installed and maintained. Next slide.
I think that one's mine.
There you go.
So, following the presentation, we will be sending everyone an email with a copy of the video or of the slide deck, as well as a copy of this checklist. And this is something that we essentially broke down the different requirements from the EPA's fact sheet and added a link so that you can view the source document. So if you do have questions about whether or not you need to do that, you can actually look at the permit and go through it to determine whether or not that specific item applies to you. Luke's presentation will also help with that as well. So just a resource for all of you to have as you're going through your NOIs and as you're developing your SWIPs or reviewing your SWIPs. You can use this to kind of gauge whether or not you do need to add these things to your SWIP and to your NOI. And that will, again, be available. Luke, final thoughts from you. Luke, you're muted.
There you go. My dog was barking, so I had to shut him up. But anyway, first of all, I want to thank HalenHardy for having me on. This is the first time I've ever met Karen. She's salty. She knows what she's talking about. She communicates well. I understand a lot of things that I am better since talking with her. They're a great company, and so I love what I do. I know they love what they do. We're here for you. We want to make these laws, these rules, these regulations as simple for you as possible. You don't have a whole lot of time to dive into a permit and understand all the language. We can make that easy for you. We have experience throughout the entire country providing training and providing, in my case, for sure, the expert testimony. I'm sure they probably have some too, but things that can help you in the future. So, we do offer here, you have my MS4 course, but we offer credentialed training throughout the entire country and online. And I specifically create our training for your permit in your particular state so that you're not sitting there wondering, well, that's kind of a generic thing. I wonder if I apply this. No, every time we go in a state, we provide specific training for people. So with that, thanks so much for having me. Karen, everybody, it's been an honor, and I look forward to the future with you guys.
Thank you, Luke. And this time we will open it up to any questions. Sarah, if we have anything there. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. We do not currently have any questions. We'll give it a minute or so here.
Okay, there we go. Now we're back.
And while we're waiting for questions, you guys might not have any, because this stuff is like, and it's not uncommon for this to happen. It happens all the time, and you're just absorbing. And good, we do have a question here. So let's see what he has to say there.
It's from Peter, and he says the limits on petroleum products on site. Is that just stored products, or does it include on vehicle fuel as well?
Do you want to answer that?
To my knowledge, I don't remember that being spelled out within the terms of this permit. I know from the industrial side, they tend to look at that if the on-site, if the vehicle is 55 gallons or more. So they kind of view that as oil-filled equipment. And at least from the industrial side, that's kind of how it goes. I didn't see any language within the permit. Did you, Luke?
No, there's not language within it, but I do want to address this just briefly. I was working on a job the other day. This is actually earlier this year. And one of the, it was a loader, actually a truck, had a significant leak. And it rained soon after that, and that oil that was saturated in the soil got carried along and put into the detention pond. Well, there was a skimmer on it, and it skimmed that oil right directly into that creek. So even though there may not be a requirement for vehicle storage, and understanding that they can leak, hydraulic fluid, stuff like that, make sure that stuff's contained in such a way that it's not going to be discharged off site. And again, it was shocking to me that sheet flow carried it into the detention pond. It was skimmed directly off into the creek. So you states that actually have skimmers, make sure you're not adding a pollutant like an oil, petroleum, hydrocarbon to that creek.
Great point.
We have another question. What is the effective date of the new EPA requirements?
It was March 18th.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yes. So the permit is already in effect. And so if you do have a permit that was in effect from 2017, look for those things, make those updates, and I believe they need to be submitted by May 18th for any changes from 2017 to 2022. If you do need to update your permit, if you do have continuing operations.
I know that you have to file a notice of intent. I believe it's within 90 days of the expiration and the entrance of the new permit. So make sure you do that. As far as the new requirements, you don't have to address those in another plan submittal for your SWIP submittal. You just need to make sure you file that new notice of intent.
That's all we have for questions at the moment.
Okay.
I think we can wrap up at this point. I want to, Luke, Karen, Sarah, thank you very much for everything. This is a great information. Some key takeaways. Luke, I know you mentioned a couple times the intent to comply. I think is really valuable and something to really take away from this presentation to eliminate any ambiguity as you're finalizing the site. So thank you very much for being here. Thanks everybody for joining. And again, as Karen mentioned, keep an eye out for those emails. We're going to be providing a couple resources to you as well. This copy of this presentation is going to be on our blog section of our website, HalenHardy.com. You can see our other webinars as well as some free complimentary training at your own pace training. So thanks everybody for being here. And with that, we'll close for today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.